The bell above the shop's entrance jingled as a gust of cold wind pushed the door open. A teenage boy stepped inside, rubbing his hands together for warmth. His clothes were worn, a tattered hoodie barely shielding him from the biting winter air. His sneakers, scuffed and too big for his feet, left faint, wet prints on the polished floor. Behind the counter, Mr. Reynolds, the shop owner, barely glanced up. He recognized the boy immediately. This wasn't the first time he had wandered into Reynolds' corner store, and frankly, the sight of him irritated the old man. "You again?" Mr. Reynolds muttered, shaking his head. The boy, Eli, didn't respond immediately. His eyes wandered around the store, scanning the shelves lined with snacks, instant noodles, and bottles of water. His stomach ached. He hadn't eaten since yesterday, and even then it was only a half-eaten sandwich he had found near a dumpster. A few customers stood near the register, an elderly woman picking out cough syrup, a man scrolling through his phone, waiting for his turn. They barely noticed the teenage boy, but Mr. Reynolds did. Eli took a slow step forward, hesitating near the small rack of discounted pastries. A single donut sat there, slightly stale, but still edible. Mr. Reynolds sighed loudly and crossed his arms. "What do you want, kid? You gonna buy something or just stand there like a stray dog?" The words stung, but Eli was used to them. He had heard worse. I just wanted to look," Eli mumbled, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yeah? Well, I don't run a museum," Mr. Reynolds snapped. "You look with your wallet, not your eyes." The tension in the store thickened. A woman near the back glanced up, sensing the hostility, but quickly looked away. Eli's fingers curled into fists inside his hoodie's pockets. He knew this routine. Every time he stepped inside, the old man made sure to remind him he wasn't welcome. But tonight, the cold was unbearable, and even a few minutes inside felt like a blessing. "Hey, I'll be quick," Eli said, forcing a small, polite smile. "I just need a minute." Mr. Reynolds scoffed. "You don't have a minute. Get out. I don't want your kind hanging around scaring my paying customers." Eli swallowed hard. He wasn't a thief. He wasn't trying to cause trouble. He just wanted a second to feel like a normal kid, to pretend he had a choice between the snacks on the shelves instead of whatever scraps he could find outside. But Mr. Reynolds wasn't having it. He stepped out from behind the counter, moving closer. "I said, get out!" Eli took a step back, his hunger overshadowed by humiliation. He could feel the stares now. The customers weren't saying anything, but their silence felt louder than words. Then, just as Eli turned toward the door, it swung open again. A towering figure stepped inside, nearly filling the doorway. The air shifted. Everyone in the store, Mr. Reynolds included, froze. Eli blinked in disbelief. Shaquille O'Neal had just walked into Reynolds' corner store. The tiny bell above the door jingled again, but this time it wasn't followed by the hesitant steps of a hungry teenager. Instead, heavy, confident footsteps echoed through the small store, making the linoleum floor creak under the weight. A hush fell over the shop. Even the old radio, which had been playing a scratchy blues tune, seemed to fade into the background. Eli, still standing near the entrance, slowly looked up, and his breath caught in his throat. Shaquille O'Neal. Yes, the Shaquille O'Neal. The 7-feet, 1-inch basketball legend filled the doorway like a mountain had just appeared inside the store. His broad shoulders seemed to shrink the space around him, and his deep brown eyes scanned the room with quiet authority. He wore a thick black coat, a beanie pulled low over his head, but even that couldn't disguise his larger-than-life presence. The few customers inside reacted almost instantly. The man with the phone suddenly straightened up, his thumb hovering over his screen. The elderly woman near the pharmacy section adjusted her glasses as if unsure if her eyes were playing tricks on her. Even Mr. Reynolds, who had just been barking at Eli, went completely still, his mouth slightly open. Eli, however, was too stunned to move. Shaq's gaze swept the store, landing briefly on the display of snacks, the old refrigerators humming in the back, and finally on Eli. He took one look at the boy's sunken face, the way he had shrunk into himself near the door, and then shifted his eyes toward Mr. Reynolds, who still hadn't said a word. For a moment, the silence in the store was thick, almost suffocating. Then, in a voice deep enough to rumble through the shelves, Shaq said, "What's going on here?" Mr. Reynolds swallowed hard. He had been in business for over 20 years, seen all kinds of people walk through his doors, but he had never expected to come face to face with a living basketball legend. He quickly straightened his apron, forcing a chuckle. Nothing, Mr. O'Neill, sir. Just a little misunderstanding." Shaq didn't look convinced. His eyes flickered back to Eli, taking in the way his hands were still buried in his pockets, his shoes soaked from the cold outside. "You." Shaq nodded toward Eli. "You good, kid?" Eli hesitated. It had been so long since someone had asked him that, since someone had actually looked at him, not as a nuisance, not as a problem, but as a person. He glanced at Mr. Reynolds, who was now shifting uncomfortably behind the counter. The customers in the store were watching, waiting to see what would happen next. Eli's throat felt tight, but he managed a small nod. Yeah, I'm good." Shaq didn't break eye contact. "You hungry?" That one question felt like a punch to the chest. Eli's stomach twisted painfully. He wanted to lie, to say he was fine, that he wasn't starving, that the reason he came in wasn't because the smell of warm bread and hot coffee was the only good thing he had felt all day. But before he could answer, Shaq turned back to Mr. Reynolds. "Go ahead and ring up whatever he wants," he said, his tone casual but firm. "On me." A stunned silence followed. Mr. Reynolds blinked, his hands gripping the edge of the counter. I don't think—" Shaq raised an eyebrow, just a little. Mr. Reynolds stopped talking. "Give the kid whatever he needs," Shaq repeated, this time slower, as if daring the shop owner to argue. The tension in the air was so thick it could be cut with a knife. Eli felt every set of eyes in the store burning into him, waiting to see what he would do. For the first time in a long time, someone stood up for him. Someone powerful. Someone who didn't just look at him with pity, but with respect. And Mr. Reynolds? The way his face twisted in frustration almost made Eli smile. The tension in the store was thick, hanging in the air like an approaching storm. Mr. Reynolds stood frozen behind the counter, his fingers gripping the edge, as if the wood itself could anchor him. His face was a mix of frustration and forced politeness, the kind people wore when they knew they were outmatched. Eli, still near the entrance, couldn't believe what he had just heard. Shaquille O'Neal, a man whose name was known around the world, had just offered to buy him whatever he wanted. No sneering, no disgust, no hesitation. Just a simple, powerful statement. For a long, stretched-out second, nobody moved. Then Shaq's deep voice rumbled again, breaking the silence. "Well?" He turned his gaze back to Mr. Reynolds. "You heard me." The store owner's jaw tensed, his pride visibly battling against the situation. He glanced around, noticing how the few customers had stopped what they were doing. The man with the phone had started recording. The elderly woman by the pharmacy section clutched her purse, watching closely. Even the cashier, a nervous-looking young man in a red apron, had gone completely still. Mr. Reynolds hated this. He had spent years running this shop, controlling who came in and who didn't. And now, in a matter of seconds, that control had been ripped away by a kid and a celebrity. With a tight, forced smile, he exhaled sharply through his nose. "Fine," he muttered, reluctantly turning to the register. Shaq clapped his hands together once, the sound echoing through the store. "Good man. Now, kid, go get what you need." Eli hesitated. He had spent so much of his life being told no that the idea of actually choosing something, without shame, without someone glaring at him, felt unreal. Was this really happening? "Go on," Shaq encouraged, tilting his head toward the shelves. "Ain't nobody stopping you now." Eli's feet finally moved, but slowly, like he was still expecting someone to grab his arm and tell him to leave. He had never been in this position before. The store, which had once felt so hostile, now felt different, like the walls had been pushed back, like the shelves weren't closing in on him. He walked down an aisle, scanning the shelves, but his mind raced. How much should he take? What if it was too much? Would Shaq regret offering? Would Mr. Reynolds use this as an excuse to hate him even more? His fingers hovered over a simple pack of instant noodles. Cheap, easy. He could cook it with hot water if he could find some later. But then he felt Shaq's presence behind him. "That all you're gonna get?" Shaq's voice was calm, but there was something knowing in it, like he had seen this before. Eli swallowed hard. He turned his head slightly, glancing up at the man towering over him. "I don't want to take too much," he admitted, his voice quiet. Shaq let out a small chuckle, shaking his head. "Man, listen, when someone offers to help, you don't gotta hold back like you're a burden." Eli didn't know how to respond to that. Shaq reached forward, grabbing a shopping basket off a nearby rack. He handed it to Eli, then bent down slightly, lowering his voice like he was sharing a secret. "I've been in places where I didn't have much," Shaq said. "I know how it feels to be scared to take up space, but you deserve better than just one pack of noodles, kid." Eli's chest tightened. For years he had felt invisible, like his existence was something people just tolerated at best. But Shaq spoke to him like he mattered, like he wasn't just some nameless homeless kid in a store, but a real person. His grip on the basket tightened. Then, for the first time in what felt like forever, Eli did something he hadn't done in a long time. He allowed himself to take. He grabbed 2 more packs of noodles, then a bottle of water, a pack of protein bars. Shaq gave him a nod of approval but didn't say anything. He just let Eli move at his own pace. Behind them, Mr. Reynolds watched in silent frustration. This wasn't how the night was supposed to go. This wasn't supposed to happen. And yet, no matter how much it burned him, he couldn't stop it. As Eli placed a few more items into the basket, a loaf of bread, a small jar of peanut butter, and a pack of socks from the back aisle, he felt something strange creeping into his chest. Relief. For the first time in what felt like forever, he wasn't worrying about his next meal. He wasn't strategizing how to make a few stolen bites last for days. He wasn't preparing for a sneer, an insult, or worse, someone calling the cops on him just for existing in the wrong place. He was just shopping. Shaq, towering beside him, glanced down at the basket with a satisfied nod. "That's more like it." Eli tried not to grin, but a small, shy smile cracked through. Together they walked back toward the register, where Mr. Reynolds stood stiffly, his fingers drumming against the counter. His face was red, his forced politeness barely masking his irritation. "Is that all?" he asked, through clenched teeth, eyes flicking toward Shaq. Shaq looked at Eli. "That's everything." Eli nodded. "Yeah, this is more than enough." Shaq didn't question it, didn't try to push him to take more, didn't make him feel guilty for taking too little. He just reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his wallet. The store went silent again as Shaq placed a thick, crisp $100 bill on the counter. Mr. Reynolds stared at it for a second, his lips pressing into a thin line. Without a word, he snatched the bill and started ringing up the items, his fingers moving faster than usual, as if he wanted the moment to be over as quickly as possible. The elderly woman in the back leaned forward, watching closely. The man with the phone was still recording, his eyes flicking between Shaq and Eli. As Mr. Reynolds scanned the last item, he muttered, "Totals $38.50. "Keep the change," Shaq said casually. Mr. Reynolds stiffened. His hand hovered over the register for a moment, as if debating whether to argue, but then he shoved the rest of the money into the till. Eli could feel the anger radiating off the man, but what could he do? He had been put in his place, not by violence, not by threats, but by something he had never expected. Kindness. Shaq grabbed the plastic bag filled with Eli's things and handed it to him. "Here you go, little man." Eli hesitated before taking it. His fingers curled around the bag's handles, his chest feeling strangely tight. "Thank you," he said softly. Shaq gave him a small pat on the shoulder. "Ain't nothing." But to Eli it was everything. Mr. Reynolds let out a huff, arms crossed. "You're going to make a habit of this, kid?" he asked bitterly. Before Eli could even think of a response, Shaq turned his head sharply toward the store owner. "What did you say?" The tone was different now. It wasn't friendly, wasn't playful. Mr. Reynolds froze. Shaq took a slow step forward, and even though he wasn't trying to intimidate, his sheer size and presence made the air feel heavier. "I said," Shaq repeated, his voice lower this time. "What did you just say to him?" The store owner swallowed, suddenly aware that every single eye in the shop was on him. I didn't mean—" Shaq didn't need to say anything else. His silence was louder than any warning. Mr. Reynolds quickly busied himself with the register, pretending to count something that didn't need counting. Eli watched the whole thing unfold, and something inside him shifted. For the first time, he saw power used in a way that wasn't meant to harm, but to protect. Shaq exhaled, then placed a large, heavy hand on Eli's shoulder. "You need anything else?" Eli shook his head. His throat felt tight, but this time it wasn't from hunger or shame. Shaq nodded. "All right, then." As they turned to leave, the old woman near the back suddenly spoke up. "That was a good thing you did, young man." At first, Eli thought she was talking to Shaq, but then he realized she was talking to him. Heat rushed to his face. He wasn't used to praise. He wasn't used to being seen at all. Thanks," he said awkwardly. As he and Shaq stepped outside, the cold air hit Eli's face again, but this time it didn't feel quite as harsh, because for the first time in a long time, he wasn't just surviving, he was living. The night air outside the store was crisp, carrying the scent of distant rain and the faint hum of city life. Eli clutched the plastic bag of groceries against his chest, still unable to process what had just happened. He had walked into that store expecting humiliation. He had walked out with food, warmth, and something else, dignity. Shaq stretched his massive arms, letting out a deep breath. "You got somewhere safe to go, kid?" Eli hesitated. He hated this question. Usually he dodged it, made something up, said he was staying with a friend or heading home soon. But this time he didn't want to lie. His fingers tightened around the bag. Not really. Shaq's expression didn't change. No pity, no surprise. Just understanding. "All right," he said simply. Then without hesitation he gestured toward a sleek, black SUV parked near the curb. "Come on, let's get you a real meal." Eli blinked. "Wait, what?" Shaq grinned. "You didn't think I was just going to leave you here with some noodles, did you?" Eli's stomach growled at the mention of food, betraying any doubts he had. He hesitated for only a second before nodding. Okay. They climbed into the SUV, the seats more comfortable than anything Eli had sat in for months. The driver, a well-dressed man with a calm expression, nodded at Shaq in the mirror. "Where to, boss?" "Somewhere good," Shaq said. Then he turned to Eli. "You like burgers?" Eli almost laughed. Who doesn't? A meal like no other. 15 minutes later, they pulled up to an upscale diner, one of those places Eli had only ever stared at from the outside, the kind with glowing neon signs and food that smelled way too good to be affordable. Shaq led the way inside, the bell above the door jingling as they entered. Almost immediately the staff lit up. "Shaq!" a waitress gasped, her eyes wide with excitement. A few customers turned their heads, whispering. Shaq just grinned. "What's up, y'all?" As they took a seat in a booth, Eli felt completely out of place. The warm lighting, the friendly chatter of other diners, the smell of freshly grilled food. It was all too normal. And that's what scared him, because normal had never been his life. "You look like you're thinking too much," Shaq said, scanning the menu. Eli exhaled, shaking his head. "I'm just not used to this." Shaq didn't press. Instead, he slid the menu over. "Order whatever you want." Eli hesitated, scanning the glossy pages. Everything looked too expensive, but Shaq had made it clear this wasn't charity. It wasn't a handout. It was just kindness. So, for once, he let himself want something. "I'll have the double cheeseburger," he said cautiously. "With fries." Shaq nodded approvingly. "Good choice." He turned to the waitress. "And bring him the biggest milkshake y'all got." Eli's eyes widened. "Wait, what?" The waitress laughed. "You got it, Shaq." The conversation that changed everything. As they ate, the tension in Eli's shoulders slowly melted. The food was better than anything he'd had in months. Juicy, warm, filling. Every bite was like a reminder that, for tonight at least, he didn't have to worry about his next meal. But what struck him most was the way Shaq talked to him. Not like a lost cause, not like someone who needed saving, just like a person. "So, what's your story, kid?" Shaq asked, dipping a fry in ketchup. Eli hesitated. No one ever really asked. And when they did, they didn't actually care. But Shaq wasn't like other people. So Eli told him. Not everything, but enough. That he'd been in and out of shelters. That his mum had struggled with addiction. That one day she left and never came back. That he had been on his own ever since. Shaq listened, really listened. No judgment, no fake sympathy, just quiet understanding. When Eli finished, he expected awkward silence. Instead, Shaq leaned back, crossing his arms. "You know," he said, "I wasn't always rich." Eli raised an eyebrow. "Come on, man, you're Shaq." Shaq chuckled. "Yeah, but before that, I was just a kid like you. Grew up in a small apartment with my mom and stepdad. We didn't have much. But you know what changed everything?" Eli shook his head. Shaq tapped his chest. "Somebody believed in me." Eli frowned. "You mean basketball?" Shaq nodded. "That was part of it. But more than that, I had people who told me I was worth something. That I wasn't just another kid people could ignore." Eli swallowed hard. That feeling, the one he could never name, tightened in his chest again.